welcome to chapter 15 on file system internals. This is relatively a much shorter chapter. So we will discuss a few important things like the virtual file system and NFS, and we'll be done soon. So the key ideas over here are like this. We will discuss file systems mounting and partitions. Then we'll discuss virtual file systems and how they interface with remote file systems such as NFS and the unique consistency issues that they throw up. So the objectives are as follows. The first is to delve into the details of the file systems and their implementation, explore booting and file sharing, and finally describe remote file systems using NFS as an example. So the file systems, as we have discussed, primarily create an intelligent layer, a hierarchical layer of data on top of a dumb storage device. So a storage device itself can be sliced into partitions, where a partition is a virtual disk and a partition can hold volumes. Occasionally a volume can span multiple partitions, even though this is not the norm. And each volume is formatted into a file system. So this formatting basically means that we create the metadata that is needed to hold the structures of the file system, and this typically involves storing the super block, which in the case of a fat table is the fat table itself. In the case of inodes, it is basically the root inode, which is slash, and all the other compulsory files and directories that we have in a bare bones inode based file system. And what are the inode based file systems? Any file system on Unix or Linux such as ext3, ext4 and so on use inodes. There can be a large number of file systems. As we can see, a volume can be one-to-one mapped to the partition, or a volume that hosts a file system could have multiple partitions in it, even though this is not all that common. So then we had discussed the idea of mount points in the last two lectures. A mount point basically means there are different points of the overall directory tree different file systems hold. Different file systems are used to implement them. For example, the slash file system could be, the slash directory could be in a certain file system. Then slash dev could be another file system over here, which is different of course. And similarly, we could have a bunch of other file systems, like for example slash tmp for storing temporary files. This could be a different file system. So it is possible for a single machine to have a large number of file systems connected in the same directory tree, such that we can happily traverse the set of directories without actually realizing that we are straddling file system boundaries. So we are going from one file system to the other, we will not realize. For example, consider the proc file system, which is special. It enables communication between the processor and the kernel. So a file like slash proc slash cpu info, this basically gives the information of the CPU, which basically means how many CPUs are there in the system, what are their specs, what is the current frequency and so on. So this is a specially implemented file system, which is a way for the kernel to kind of export or publish its runtime parameters. But when we actually access it, all right, we never get the feeling that we are actually jumping a file system. So from slash, we go to slash proc, and then let's say we read CPU info or mem info, and we never feel the difference, even though in reality, we have a bunch of file systems that are all connected in the same directory. They share the same naming space. So coming to partitions and mounting, a partition can be either raw, which is just a sequence of blocks, or it could be formatted, which means that there is a file system on top of it. Furthermore, we can have a boot volume, essentially a volume on top of a partition whose job is to boot. So this is special, as we have seen. This contains enough code to initialize the IO devices and as well as locate and load the kernel from the storage device to the memory device. All right. Occasionally, a boot block may also contain a small graphical user interface, which can tell you that look, currently 2 or 3 operating systems are installed. Which one do you want to boot? So this is also called a bootloader. Okay, so it will also show you the list of operating systems such that if you have a dual boot system, you can say that whether I want to boot on Windows or boot on Linux. Then we can have a root partition. So this is also called the root partition, which contains the OS, and other partitions can hold either other OSs or let's say like D colon, E colon, F and F colon on Windows drives. They can simply contain other file systems without bootable OSs. So all these partitions are mounted at boot time. So mounted basically means that we attach them to the same directory tree. So on Linux, let's say that slash proc is a separate file system that is attached. Let's say we have multiple hard drives on Windows and they are all attached as C colon, D colon and E colon. So even though, one might be a hard drive, one might be an SSD and one might be a DVD with their individual file systems, we don't get to see that. So we see the same naming system, naming scheme, and we feel that all of them are like in one large virtual directory tree. And there, of course, the hard drive is mounted on C colon, the SSD is mounted on D colon, and the DVD is mounted on E colon. We can also, on Windows, there is an option to map a network drive. So we can, let's say, create an F colon, which let's say is a Google Drive or a Dropbox drive, right? Or basically, it is the it is an exported file system of some other server, which we shall see how that works in a later part of this lecture. So at mount time, whenever we are mounting, we check the consistency of the file system, which basically means we check the metadata. So the metadata should broadly make sense. And if let's say the metadata says that there are 1,000 blocks in the disk, that should be the case. And if we find that the file system metadata is broadly correct, then we add it to the mount table. The mount table essentially says what are all the file systems and where exactly are they mounted at. And we have already seen an example in a previous lecture where the df command shows you all the mount points. You can additionally run it as df -h, where -h is for a human readable format. So coming to file systems and mounting, well, in a typical Unix kind of machine, this file system could be mounted here, Fred could be mounted here, help could be mounted here. And as you can see, we can take an existing directory tree and we can remove all of these mount points and again remount this over here. So this will be the structure of the new directory tree. So we can mount and we can unmount, but as far as the user is concerned, all of this appears to be a single virtual file system, even though it is actually not, right? So you have separate physical file systems. So let's come to file sharing, which is an important point in the discussion, which allows multiple users to access the files. So we have discussed permission and protection bits of owner, group and all permissions. And one important point is due, that for directories, to basically enter the directory, all right, and to let's say run an ls command in it and to see the contents and so on, we need execute permission on the directory. So now let's discuss the main idea of virtual file systems. So what we have been maintaining up till now is that we have the same directory tree. Consider a virtual view of the file system. At different points, different individual file systems are attached, but the user doesn't get to see that. As far as the user is concerned, the entire directory tree is a single file system. Even though let's say this subtree is part of the USB and this subtree is there in the DVD, but the user doesn't get to see much of that. So the way that the Unixes and the way that Linux actually does this is that they implement a virtual file system which the user sees, and the virtual file system interfaces with the physical file systems. So what the VFS does is that it provides a system call interface, an API to different types of files. So a file doesn't really care whether, sorry, a program doesn't really care if the file resides on the USB or on the DVD, right? So that is independent of the location of the file. So what we do is we separate the generic file system operations like open, create, read, write, seek, and so on from the implementation of the file system. So every file system that is implemented on Linux, be it ext2, be it ext3, be it proc, it doesn't matter. All of them need to have the same interface, which will kind of connect them to the virtual file system, and the applications will directly issue system calls, and the system calls will first be trapped by the virtual file system, and then they will be passed on to the actual file system. So this separates the generic operations from the specific ones. All right. So what we do is we create V nodes, which are essentially inodes in the virtual file system, which hold the details, and they can either be a regular file or a network file, it doesn't matter. And after that, as we have said, we have the layer of applications here on top. And then we have a VFS layer at the bottom over here. And then we have physical file systems. So the job of the VFS layer is to capture the file system API calls and send it to the actual file system. So this is just an example illustration of the same, where we have a disk-based file system, another disk-based file system, and a network file system. The user does not get to see any of that because the virtual file system hides all the real details. It provides a simple interface to user programs, and then they can create read-write files based on the simple interface. So the implementation of the file system, well, for the VFS, Linux has 4 object types. We have seen the inode. The other object is the file. So a file is essentially an instance of an opened file. A super block, which is the metadata of the entire file system. So we have seen that. And D entry is a directory entry. So the operations that VFS defines are as follows. So basically each kind of object, each kind of an open file will have a pointer to a function table. So function table basically has addresses of routines that actually implement the function on that object. For example, if let's say it's the open call, so the user application can just do an open system call, and the open system call will basically then hit a table, and that will be redirected to the actual function table of the file system that is implementing the functionality for this particular file. So that will get the open call and it will do its work accordingly. The same holds for close, the same holds for read, write, and mmap. Mmap is for memory mapping a file. So these are some generic functions, and VFS, as we have seen, is a virtual layer. Now let's look at remote file systems. So these remote file systems as of today are quite popular, particularly in a server client kind of setup where there is one server that implements and exports the file system. And we have different clients, let's say different lab machines. The moment we log in, the home directory pretty much comes from the server. And the client machine, the user on the client machine never perceives the fact that the home directory is actually on the server. So of course, there are simple methods like copying files and using FTP and so on, but we are not looking at that. We are looking at a truly distributed file system where I can write something on this machine to my home directory. I can then go to another machine and again see the same changes and write to something. The changes are visible over here. So it's kind of like creating a file system over machines which are connected over the network. Of course, we can expand this, we can extend this to something like a file system that is pretty much based on Google Drive or Dropbox. So if I have a single Google Drive, let's say, what I can do is that I can map the Google Drive to a folder on my desktop. Very easy to do. You can go to Google's website and you will get and a small application. The application can then be installed on, let's say, your Windows or Linux desktop. That will map your Google Drive to a folder on the local desktop. After that, any reads or writes will automatically reflect on the Google Drive and any other connected clients. All right. So, of course, the anonymous access part was something that was done earlier, but this does not hold as of today. So, as of today, the authentication does happen in the sense my Google username and password are required for me to do the mapping and to operate the distributed file system, which of course is centered at Google. And I can do the same for Dropbox, I can do the same for Microsoft SkyDrive, and for that matter, any provider. So, a distributed file system has pretty much grown to a web avatar, which, as you are seeing, this is very easy to use in the sense that I can keep my files in Google, but I can also modify them on my cell phone and automatically it will be visible everywhere. So let's look at the client server model NFS, which is the middle layer, this one over here. So this is a distributed file system, typically in a lab kind of setup where you have one server and several machines. So users go and use the lab, and then of course the machines don't have separate file systems. They have they don't have separate file systems for the home directories of students. The home directories of students are located in a central server, and the client machine, essentially the moment I log in, let's say the URL of my home directory, the path of my home directory is home/sr Sarangi. Then automatically this the home directory of mine is mounted at this path and the contents come from the server. So this is the way that in a client server model in an NFS kind of setting, we can do a sharing between the server where the server provides access to the file system and the client uses a protocol to mount the remote file system. So of course here spoofing and then claiming to be somebody else and running away with network and eavesdropping on network packets, all of this is possible, but there are a lot of schemes to ensure that the communication is secure. So I will not really get into that now. So we will have some lectures later. So NFS, for example, does have some amount of security where we have the notion of user ID. So every user needs to authenticate herself with a password. And once that is done, the remote file system, as I mentioned over here, is mounted. And subsequently, any operation that I do on the client, unbeknownst to me, the VFS of the client actually sends it to the server, and then the reads and writes happen there. And the server subsequently checks for permissions and it takes care of reads and writes. So, of course, this process is inefficient in the sense every time I write, if I send a network message, it will make things slow. So, we will see how to make this process more efficient. So, now NFS is not the only server client file system, there are a few more. So, for example, let's say in Windows based systems, we use CIFS. So, CIFS is also called an Active Directory based service. So, this allows users to authenticate their network logins and it also allows them to map file systems the same way that we did in NFS. Right, and the NFS is called the network file system, and this works for almost all systems, Linux, Windows, and everything. And nowadays, even the Windows CIFS file system also works across a wide range of machines. So the primary technologies that, let's say, CIFS uses is the Active Directory Distributed Naming Service, where, as you can see from the first point, a distributed naming service provides a unified access for any information that is needed for remote computing. And this basically would be like user login information, home directory information, and so on. Subsequently, we can also use the domain name system or the DNS to translate from host name to network addresses. So normally what happens is that in a server client system, typically because IP addresses keep changing, IP address is a network address, and typically because that keeps changing, the way that we would record, let's say, the name of the server could just be like server1.mylab.myuniversity.edu, for example. So in this case, we would use such kind of naming services and as well as network information services for not only finding the address of the server at runtime, but also mapping user IDs, checking for passwords, and so on. So in this context, what is typically used in many open source implementations, particularly when it comes to authenticating users when they are trying to map remote file system drives, is that we use the lightweight directory access protocol, or the LDAP protocol. So what the LDAP protocol does is that it is basically a directory of users. So for example, let's say in a large university, they would have a single LDAP server that would provide a directory of users. So this is basically to tell you that is this a valid user or not, and if let's say that this is a valid user, what is the user ID? The user ID is an integer. So the LDAP server can be queried, and also the LDAP server may have a password, may not have a password. But this is a secure distributed naming mechanism where we can find whether a certain user genuinely exists or not, and what is the user ID of the user. And subsequently, we'll have other password databases to check if the password is correct or not. And if all of that matches, then we can fetch the details of the user, including the details of the home directory. And then using either NFS or CIFS, mount the home directory on the client. The user on the client means the client machine, and the user will subsequently use our home directory on the client machine. And needless to say, all the changes will be reflected at the server. And if let's say there is another client machine that is connected to the server, and let's say some other user, let's say my friend is accessing my home directory, she will also be able to see all the changes that I make. So if we come to some consistency semantics, so the idea is that since multiple people are accessing, editing, reading, writing files in the file system at the same point of time, we need to create some correctness criteria. So we need to show how multiple users can access a shared file simultaneously. This is because modifications of data will be observed by all users, and there is a need to create some degree of correctness. So that's the reason different file systems have different semantics. So let's look at the Unix semantics, which we have discussed earlier. So to discuss the Unix semantics or even other semantics, we will use the term called file session. This is basically all the accesses between the time that a file has been opened and a file has been closed. So all the accesses between them is called the file session. Okay. So in Unix semantics, it was not really meant for a distributed environment, but nonetheless, this is the semantics that any write to an open file is immediately visible to all the other programs that have opened the same file. So of course, in this case, a write is being done in non-exclusive mode. So assuming that that is happening, the moment I write, all the other users of the file have to get to know immediately. So where of course the word immediately is not all that precisely defined. So we need to define it more precisely in a system sense, but the way that we should understand is that with as little delay as possible, the write should be visible. Another mode of sharing will allow users to share pointers to the current position in the file, the current seek pointer. And also, let's say if exclusive access is there, then the contention will cause delays, right? Because multiple people cannot work on the same file at the same time. In comparison, another file system called the Andrew file system, which is also available in its open avatar called OpenAFS, it has a different kind of semantics. It basically says that writes to an open file are not visible during that session. So let's say if I have opened a file and I'm writing to it, it's not necessary that others will see it during that session. But let's say I close the file, And at this point, it is possible that there could be multiple copies and they can be changed independently. But let's say that after I close the file and somebody else opens the file, they are guaranteed to see all the changes made by closed sessions. Okay, so that is the semantics of AFS. Now coming to the NFS semantics. So NFS was originally called the Network File System. It was released by Sun Microsystems. So now, of course, it has moved to more of an open source avatar, and it's extremely popular. NFS version 3 and version 4, they're extremely popular. So in almost all universities, NFS is used. So this is primarily used over a LAN, a local area network. Usage over a WAN is far more uncommon. And given the fact that NFS was originally part of the Sun OS operating system, it is quite reliable, quite robust. It can use the TCP/IP protocol if that's what you want. So when you configure NFS, you can specify whether you want the reliable TCP/IP protocol, where if there is a packet drop, then the packet is retransmitted, or you can use the unreliable datagram protocol (UDP), where if let's say a packet is dropped, it is not necessarily retransmitted. So this option is there, and this can be specified while mounting an NFS volume, that which protocol you want to use, TCP or UDP, right? So in the NFS world, we have a set of interconnected workstations typically connected on a LAN, and they have their independent file systems. But for what all the clients do, let's say the client machines, what they do is that they basically mount directories that the server is exporting. So let's say the server is exporting my home directory, and I have logged in from two clients at the same time. Both the clients will mount my home directory at the server. Any change that I make has to go here and ultimately reflect over here, and vice versa. So the mounted directory in this case will look like an integral subtree of the local file system. And of course, let's see if if the same directory in the local file system already existed, that would be overwritten by the mounted directory. It will essentially get not overwritten but replaced. So basically in this case, the way that I actually mount, so Linux has a mount command. So the way that I actually mount is that I call the mount command. So this can be done either at the command line if I have adequate permissions, or it can be done at the time of boot. So when I do it at the time of boot, this mechanism is called AutoFS or auto file system. So at the time of boot, it runs a small script which essentially runs the mount commands for you. This process is called auto mounting. But let's say if I want to manually mount, I can call the mount command. I need to specify where I need to mount a directory from. So essentially, what is the path of the remote directory and what is the path of the local directory where I want to mount it to. So in the remote directory, I need to specify the name of the server. So this could be either the name of the server, like server name dot something something, or the IP address and the port, and also the directory within the server that is being exported. So once that is done, I mount it to a local mount point, and subsequently when I access the local mount point, then the files in the remote directory can be accessed in an extremely transparent manner. It will appear as if I'm accessing a local directory, even though the secret sauce is that all the writes will go to the VFS layer and the VFS will send it via NFS. So I have the user application over here. Then the writes will go to VFS. From VFS, they will go to NFS. Then over the network, they will go to the server. So basically, the key idea is that the server needs to basically export directories as well as specify the security requirements that which users can mount which file system and how do users authenticate. So one option is that they don't authenticate. The other option is they send their password via plain text. And then we will see there are more sophisticated options where they send an encrypted password and the same is verified. So one great advantage of NFS is that it is designed to operate in an extremely heterogeneous environment of different kinds of machines, different kinds of operating systems, Windows, Linux, Solaris, doesn't matter, different kinds of networks. So it's extremely flexible and portable in that sense. So the key idea, the reason that it works is because it uses a substrate that is built on top of remote procedure calls. So there is an external data representation XDR protocol, which basically bridges the gap between different implementation independent interfaces. All right, and there is code on the client side for the mount mechanism, and there is code on the server side for the remote file access service. But the key point is that unlike other file systems, NFS is stateless. So stateless basically means in this case that if let's say I am the client and I make a request to the server, so then all the information that I need to give, which is basically the file pointer, what I need to read or write and so on, everything is there in the packet that I sent. What the server needs to do is it just needs to perform that operation and return an acknowledgement. The server otherwise does not keep any state about the client. The good thing is that let's say if the client crashes or the server crashes, then we do not end up in an inconsistent state. That's the reason NFS is a stateless protocol, mainly because it needs to provide that additional degree of robustness. If it was stateful and it was maintaining a lot of state, maintaining correctness would have been much harder because if the server crashed, it would go away with all of its state. And then let's say if it woke up, clients may, if let's say, and then a client doesn't know, it could lead to a lot of corner cases. So having a stateless server for NFS turned out to be quite a good idea. So as we said, we can mount independent file systems even let's say on a mounted file system, we can take a mount point and mount one more file system on top of it. So the client's local machine, client's VFS basically will analyze the path of the directory, figure out in which real file system it is, send the request to that file system, which is the real file system. In this case, it will be this file system. And then the file system will do whatever it is that needs to be done. So if let's say it's a USB based file system, it will access the USB. If it's an NFS based file system, it will send a message over the network. So of course, NFS file systems are much smarter these days. They also have a local cache of blocks. So as far as possible, we try to locally cache them. But again, let's say every k seconds or so, which is typically 30 seconds, the changes are also sent to the server such that other clients can see them. Right? So it is not the case that I keep on writing and for 1 hour the cache is completely buffering all my writes and nothing is sent to the server. So this happens in AFS, not in NFS. So typically they say that if a change has been made, another client which has mapped the same file or same directory will see the change in 30 seconds. This is a broad rule of thumb that you will see in much of NFS's documentation. So cascading mounts, as I have said, is perfectly legal in NFS. An NFS mount protocol happens like this, that we establish an initial connection between the server and the client. The mount operation will include the name of the remote directory that is to be mounted and also the name of the server. So the name of the server might just be the host name or might be the IP address, port. If let's say NFS allows multiple ports, that is, then what the NFS code will do is that it will map it to a corresponding RPC, a remote procedure call, and forward it to the mount server. So that is the way that the NFS code works on the client and the server side. The server would have exported several file systems. So it will basically maintain a list of internal directories and name of the file system. So what it would do is it will maintain a list of an internal directory and some symbolic handle to it. The handle could be a path, may not be the exact internal path, but let's say some handle. That's the broad theoretical idea. And from the export list, which is typically stored in /etc exports, we will find all the directories that are being exported for remote mounting. And this can have additional security information as well. For example, there could be a name list of machines or a list of user IDs that are allowed to mount them. After performing the security check and after finding that whatever directory the client wants to mount that is present in the export list, the server will return a file handle. Right? So after doing all the security checks, what is returned is a file handle. A file handle is basically a token for the mounted file system. So it's a file system identifier and it's an inode number to identify the mounted directory within the exported file system. And so then once the file handle is received, what the client's VFS will do is that it will basically update the data structures at the client side to change the client user's view. This will not affect the server side, but to affect the client. So let's say if this is the client's existing directory, and let's say that this directory was mounted, so the view of the client will fundamentally change. In the sense, it will see that this point in NFS directory has been mounted. So let's say that if some file is being accessed, which is over here, automatically the client's VFS will figure out that this is within the NFS mount. All right. And then of course it will have its V nodes and so on. And using that, it will access. So in this case, the physical block ID. So if you recall, when we were discussing inodes, we had the notion of a physical block ID, which was the block ID on the disk. So in this case, the notion of the physical block ID will not clearly be a block on the disk, but we'll still have the notion of a block ID based on its position in kind of a virtual disk as far as we are concerned, because it's an exported file system. So here again, we'll first search for the data in the cache. And if we don't find it, in the case of a read, we will send a request to the server. And also in the case of a write, if we are writing at the granularity of blocks, and we don't find the block, a request has to be sent to the server for a copy of it. Subsequently, what does the NFS protocol do? Well, the NFS protocol, of course, liaises with VFS. So basically, if let's say this is the application will only make system calls, that's all. So it doesn't really care what file system it is. Then the VFS, which is in the kernel, so this part is where the kernel application boundary is. So VFS will transparently send all of those calls which are in the NFS part of the mounted directory to the NFS client module. The NFS client module will be connected to the NFS server module via RPC calls essentially. So it will direct those calls to the server if it doesn't have a local copy. And some of these calls can be searching for a file within a directory, reading a set of directory entries, manipulating symbolic links, reading, writing files, accessing attributes, and so on. So as we have discussed, NFS servers are stateless. The disadvantage is that each request has to provide the entire set of arguments. As if it is a new request, it has to provide all the arguments. This makes a request heavier but makes the protocol more robust. In comparison, NFS v4, which is newer, does have a stateful mode. But this is where I would like to give an opinion. It's not a fact, it's an opinion. So I have been setting up a lot of file systems and operating systems lately. And what I have seen is that the stateful mode does make running and operating servers in a non-robust environment quite difficult. But keeping it stateless is much simpler. Of course, the performance may dip a little bit because the requests are heavier. And also the server, since it does not know about the client, or let's say deliberately forgets about the client, it will not be able to make a lot of optimizations which it normally can if it is aware of the client. In the sense that the client is requesting, let's say, blocks 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, the server can catch this pattern and then it can prefetch the next k disk blocks and quickly serve them to the client. And in this case, it can reduce the overall latency. See, if let's say a server is stateful, it can do all of that. So it can find the pattern of disk accesses of the client and then let's say do some prefetching of data. But in a stateless mode, this is not possible to do. But that said and done, NFS v3, which is purely stateless, is very robust. And in terms of performance, it is quite good. Of course, the stateful server could be better, but v3 is still quite good. But a lot of enterprise kind of environments which need that additional extra performance, they go for file systems that have a certain amount of state. So now coming to modified data, they have to be committed to the server's disk, typically before results are returned to the client. And the reason here is that let's say the client crashes, the data is gone. But as I said, there is a window in the sense that the client need not send the data immediately because Unix semantics are not followed and a small delay is permissible. And the NFS protocol is quite simple, so it does not really provide a lot of concurrency control mechanisms in the sense if multiple clients are accessing the same file or same directory at the same time, what happens? Much of that is not specified. So the three major layers of the NFS architecture are like this. So we have the Unix file system interface, which has a regular open, read, write, close calls and file descriptors. So think of this as the application interface. So this interface is at the application layer and library calls are used to implement them. Then we have VFS. VFS does distinguish between local files and remote files, but not in the remote sense. Not really in that sense, but it does distinguish in the sense that given the path of a file, it just transfers control to the appropriate file system handler. It activates different file systems based on the path of the file and also based on the request type if there is a choice of handlers. Then it calls the NFS protocol and then the NFS service layer, which is the bottom layer of the architecture, implements the NFS protocol and pretty much liaises with the server. So the semantic view of NFS would look like this, that we have the interface of system calls that goes to VFS. There can be a bunch of other file systems including Unix's native disk-based file system. The NFS client will use an RPC XDR mechanism to connect to the server, and the server will again have an NFS module which will connect to the server's VFS, and that is how it will get access to the files within the server. NFS path name translation. So what we do is that we need to translate the path. So let's say that I have a path of the form home sr sarangi, which let us assume is an NFS mapped directory a.txt. Alright, so let's say this is the name of the file. But in reality, in the server, it could be file user home, and I might be s1 over there, and then the file could be a.txt. So it is a job of the NFS modules at both the client and the server to change the client path names into server path names. And also to maybe make this process faster, it is possible to add a lookup cache on the client side to hold the virtual nodes for remote directory names. Alright, so you can hold some vnodes such that instead of going to the server, the process of translation can be done locally. Now coming to the operations on the server side. So the remote operations that are supported, there is typically a one-to-one correspondence between Unix operations and NFS operations. NFS, as we have discussed, for performance reasons does have some degree of buffering and caching, notably a file blocks cache. So when a file is opened, the kernel basically checks if the entries in the cache are valid, in the sense that they are the latest entries, and this can be checked with the remote server. So you don't need to fetch any new content or anything. You just tell the remote server that look, as per me, a certain block, it shows the latest modification time as 5:40 p.m. Do you have that in your records, or do you have some other modification time? If the server says that look, this is the latest, then the client can go with it. Nothing else is required. And needless to say, cache file blocks are used only when they are the most up to date. All right. Then there's a file attribute cache. It is similar to a block cache where it stores attributes of the file. And furthermore, clients do not free write blocks until the server confirms that the write has been committed to the disk. So essentially what they do is that if let's say a client machine writes to something and the write is present in a block, it doesn't delete the block, but it waits for the block to be finally committed to the server's file system, and only then is it removed. So this ensures that writes don't get lost. So this brings us to the end of chapter 15, which was, as I said, a short chapter. So now we will discuss assorted aspects of operating systems, namely security, protection, and virtual memory. And finally, the last two chapters will be on case studies, Windows and Linux.